All right. Kim Yeoman is originally from Nevada. She studied social work and international development here at BYU. And in 2006 did a field study to South Africa where she was studying, I guess, just the effects of having a disability. And being in a wheelchair herself, she had a really interesting perspective on that. And so we're excited to hear more about those experiences. She's going to be telling us some more about her research, but also about the work she's doing now, educating policymakers, nonprofit organizations, and businesses on the rights of people with disabilities. She's also working within schools to promote positive disability awareness. So hopefully she'll be telling us a little bit more about that as well. We're very excited to have her today, and please join me in welcoming Kim Yeoman.
Well, I have to make sure this is going to work. I'm so excited to be here today, and I wanted to start out by telling a little bit why I chose the topic that I did. And you can see the title of my presentation is From South Africa to Cedar City, Utah, Transferring My Field Study Experience to a Professional Setting. And I have been very fortunate with my profession that I have been able to take all of the experiences that I had on my field study in South Africa and have been able to apply them in a setting that is right here in Utah. Cedar City was not where I anticipated ending up, having studied international development. I thought I would be more in a field that had some international impact. But Cedar City and rural Utah has its own interesting culture that my experience in South Africa has helped tremendously. So to start off, before I get into my research methods, I would just like to tell you why I chose to study the effects of having a disability. Obviously, it makes sense because I myself have a disability. But to understand why I chose that, I feel like I need to tell you my background a little bit. I was born with something called spina bifida, and spina bifida is a congenital defect of the spinal column, which essentially means that when I was born, my spinal cord was tethered at the base by a lot of nerves and tissues. Eventually, my spinal cord would grow, but it would stretch out because of all of the tethering at the base. I had it untethered as a baby, but as I grew older, it retethered, causing a lot of nerve damage to my legs. When I was 10, I started using crutches, which I used for about 5 years. And when I was in high school, I had to have another operation that they first thought was to do another untethering of my spinal cord, but eventually found that bone that encircles the spinal cord to protect it, a section of mine had enlarged 3 times the size that it was supposed to be and was pinching my spinal cord. And so they shaved that excess bone back, but as a result, I lost the rest of the strength in my legs and have been using a wheelchair since then. So I've had a little bit of experience in every aspect, going from being able to walk to using crutches to using a wheelchair. And it gives me an interesting perspective in working with people with disabilities because I can understand a lot of the trauma that they experience from going from being completely able to do everything that they want to trying to learn new ways of accomplishing the tasks that they need to. And it's an interesting balance for most people. I had a much easier time coping. It caught me a little by surprise. I wasn't ever expecting to be in a wheelchair, as most people aren't. But for me, it gave me a great perspective in seeing these are the things that I thought I needed to be doing, and now these are the things that I can now accomplish. And this added perspective really helped me in overcoming the things that I needed to, the barriers that I needed to get where I am today. So in going to South Africa, the first big challenge was, am I even going to be able to go? I had to sit down with Dave Schuler for a long time, and we talked it out and said, now, is this really going to be the best thing for you? Accessibility is not so great in South Africa. How are we going to address these issues? And talking it out and really realizing that I could research a topic in a very unique way made it all the more possible to actually go. And so my actual research was about having the effects of having a disability, and I wanted to do an ethnographic study that focused on accessibility and social attitudes, because those were the two topics regarding disability issues that seemed to interest me the most and affect most people. And I wanted to use the emic perspective of ethnographic research, which the emic perspective is trying to see things from the researchers, or I guess the researchee's point of view. So trying to see things the way your research participants see them. And the way I did this, my methodology was to use qualitative interviews, so just sit down and really try and figure out what made my research participants tick, rather than having them fill out a survey or do something that I wouldn't get to the heart of what it was like to be them. Because even though I was living in South Africa and seeing on a day-to-day basis what it was like to have a disability there, from the accessibility standpoint, I couldn't really change the fact that I was the crazy white American who would fly down the streets of East London at high speeds. I couldn't change that about myself. And so it gave me a small perspective of what things were like for them. Participant observation was a huge aspect of my research, just from the daily task of catching a taxi to go to where I was volunteering, to seeing how people reacted to me, to playing on a South African wheelchair rugby team. That was something that I did for a long time. That was a lot of fun. So those were some of my participant observation areas that I really focused on. The other aspect that I did was the photo voice method. And the photo voice method is having your research participants take pictures of what really matters to them. And this ended up being quite a challenge for me because a lot of my research participants were actually blind. And I wasn't sure how to go about asking them. I didn't want to offend anybody by saying, "You're blind, but can I have you take a picture and show me what you see through your eyes that you don't see out of?" And it was a really difficult task trying to go about that. But I decided to ask them anyways, and I wanted to show you just a few of the pictures that they took. Disregard the choose a layout. I don't know why that's still up there. The top picture to the left is one of my research participants, and his name is Tembikosi. And to the right of him is one of the pictures that he took. And it was fascinating to see the way they took pictures. What they would do is, to take a picture of a person, they would follow the voice of the person that they wanted to take a picture of. They would put their finger over the lens of the camera and follow the voice. And for the landscape pictures, they knew the campus of this school for the blind completely backwards and forwards. They have spent hours and hours learning to navigate this campus using their white canes, and so they knew the buildings, they knew what obstructions were in the way. And so knowing that and having that perspective gave them the opportunity to take the pictures of the buildings that they would want to take pictures of. And so it was very interesting because Tembinkosi really enjoyed taking pictures of scenery and buildings. And that seemed to be important to him because in talking with him, he lost a lot of his freedom, as anybody would becoming blind. But for him, it was an extra burden. He had been a school teacher, and once he became blind, they wouldn't let him teach anymore. He had been very active in the African National Congress and was a very important member of the electing bodies and helping officials in their duties. And once he became blind, he lost all of that. And so these buildings to him seemed to be kind of his own prison. And it was really unfortunate to see that because here in the United States, we have a lot of opportunities for blind training and for educational opportunities, various things various programs that are offered that they don't have there. They go to this school for an entire year to basically learn Braille and to learn how to navigate using a white cane. Those are the only things that they're taught. Right attached to this school is called Timbalisle, and right attached to it is a school for what they call the physically handicapped. And this school is purely to teach them suitable skills, which include basket weaving and carpentry and sewing. Those to them are the only skills that they will ever be able to usefully gain employment, which is unfortunate because many of the people I interviewed, they have been educated. They have been really outstanding in their own fields, and because of their disability, they are forced to go back to menial labor, to finding skills that outsiders view as suitable employment. This bottom picture is of a man named Luvullo, and to the left is a picture that he took of some of his schoolmates. But he was very interesting. He was actually shot in the head, and the only thing that he lost was his vision, which that in and of itself is phenomenal. It was a robbery of a restaurant that he was working at. But seeing his struggles and being ostracized from his family and his close relationships was very difficult on him. He talked frequently about wanting to start his own community specifically for people who are blind, so that they felt that they could really be a part of the community. And it was really difficult to see that because you want them to be integrated into the community. You want them to feel like they have their place and that their skills are valued and useful. And that's just not always the case there. These are just a couple of other pictures that they took. Having scanned them, you lose some of the amazing quality of them, but their perspective of things, you can see that some of the scenes are slightly skewed, but to me that adds to the beauty of it because they are really focusing on what is going to work for them. So, going on, this was the overall point of my entire research, was to give a voice to those who might not have been heard in the past. It's really difficult for people with disabilities to feel like they have a voice in their own communities. Mainstream education is a very new concept for South Africa. There are several programs that are being used as incentives for people with physical disabilities. The Nelson Mandela Children's Fund is now offering free wheelchairs for any child who is mainstreamed in with a regular school. Special schools are still very much a normal occurrence, which is unfortunate because the kids with disabilities don't get the opportunity to interact with other classmates, other peers their own age, and those other children don't get the chance to interact with a person with a disability, which perpetuates this cycle of ignorance and a lack of acceptance. And that's something that really needs to be changed, not only in South Africa, but all over the world. So that was the major point. I'm going to switch tracks a little bit and talk now about what the Disability Law Center is, which is where I am currently working. And then at the end, I will tie the two together because I really want to show you how going on a field study has impacted what I do now. And I don't think that I could effectively hold the position that I do currently without having gone on my field study. And that may just be for me, but that was, the two go hand in hand for me. The Disability Law Center is Utah's protection and advocacy agency. The protection and advocacy agencies are a federally mandated program by the United States government. However, they are all nonprofit organizations, and they are designated by the governor of each state to be the protection and advocacy agency. We are mandated by, we are designated by Governor Huntsman to be that agency for the state of Utah. In our organization, we have teams that cover various types of disability issues. We have an access and rights team, and what they do is handle accessibility issues. They go out and talk about disability rights, whether it be with employment, education, any rights that would fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act would be something that they cover. And let me go into the Americans with Disabilities Act just a little bit. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, and that is the first law that said that people with disabilities deserve the same rights as everybody else in the country. They deserve the same rights to employment, to education, to housing. All of these things were stated in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And over the years, it's lost a little bit of its push. And just in 2007, the Americans with Disabilities Restoration Act was passed. And so they will be tightening up these laws and really working with businesses and organizations to make sure that their facilities are accessible and that they are giving the services to people with disabilities that they need. So that's a little bit about the ADA. Another team that we have is the abuse and neglect team. They work a lot with nursing home facilities and really to ensure that they are getting the treatment necessary. Unfortunately, Utah has had quite a few cases against long-term care facilities and nursing facilities that they are neglecting their residents and that there have been many cases of abuse. The employment and CAT team work specifically, obviously, with employment. The CAT program is the Client Assistance Program that works with the federal vocational rehabilitation system. And we are considered the watchdog for the voc rehab system to ensure that their clients are getting the needs that the services that they need and that kind of thing. Vocational rehabilitation, that purpose is to get people with disabilities into the workforce. So if that is getting them education services, whether it be going to college or a technology college, anything like that, that would fall under voc rehab. And so we watch voc rehab to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. The education team works with special education services to make sure that the school districts are following IEPs, individualized education plans, that they are providing students with all of the services that they need. A lot of schools will say, okay, we will provide an interpreter for a deaf student 3 hours out of the day. But that's not adequate because a child who is deaf and is in school obviously needs to be there all day and needs an interpreter all day. And so we work with the state Board of Education to ensure that those needs are being met, and we go there. The institutions team works specifically with the state hospital here in Provo, the State Developmental Center, which is up in American Fork, as well as the state prison, because everyone there has specific disabilities that need rights, and they need to make sure that their services are being provided, especially at the state prison, because a lot of times people in the prison think they're in prison, they have been stripped of all of their rights, but they still have rights as a person with a disability that need to be provided even in prison. The last component is what I do, is rural outreach. I cover the 11 southern counties of Utah, and I do outreach and education. And that can cover anything from doing trainings for other organizations and businesses about various disability rights to partnering with other organizations to help them achieve the goals that they would like to with programs and different activities that they would like to accomplish. Currently, there are about 7 agencies working together to put on a Southern Utah Disability Summit. And so that's one thing that I'm helping to facilitate, to get the organizations talking and making it so that everyone has a say, because everyone in the disability community has a different idea of what the needs of the disability community are. And if there's no communication, then there's no unity and nothing will happen. No change will happen. The policymakers won't know of the needs because everyone's coming at them with a different angle. And so uniting everyone is one of the biggest focuses that we have. Another component that I do that I'll get to is I do a lot of work in the schools. And so I will go on and we'll talk about that. But we're going to go into how my field study prepared me. And this first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the School for the Blind a little bit again. This woman to the left, I already talked about Tim McCosey, but this woman's name is Sylvia, and she was a nurse before she lost her vision due to glaucoma. And it has been so hard for her. She cried and cried as she was telling me her story about how she had to give up being a nurse when she went blind. Her kids and her husband abandoned her. They didn't want anything to do with her because she went blind. There was nothing wrong with anything else of her. She lost her vision. And as a result of that, she lost everything, in her words. And it was really difficult to see because you want so much to make things better, and it just, there's not always a lot that can be done. And so changing attitudes in countries is the most important thing to do. But this prepared me a lot for what I do now in understanding where that whole perspective of a person who is blind comes from. I do a lot of work with people who are blind now, and having that understanding in a greater sense has helped me so much in my job, in working with them more effectively, and helping find more programs that will be a benefit to people who are blind. And it has been so important to have that understanding before I started. And it's amazing to see, despite everything that they have gone through, what they continue to do. They rise up and they really pick themselves up by their bootstraps and journey on. One thing that has been really interesting for me as I started looking and tying all of this together is I went to South Africa with the view that the United States is perfect in its accessibility. I had never had any problems myself, and so I didn't understand what it was like to be in an environment that wasn't accessible, because the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 10 years before I started using a wheelchair. And by that time, most things had become accessible, and so I never had to worry a lot about it. But going there and seeing that gave me a whole new perspective, and then moving to southern Utah has given me a whole new perspective in seeing that things down there are a lot like things up there, not necessarily with social attitude, but with accessibility and various problems that aren't going to go away anytime soon. There's not enough funding to get changes needed. It's a very difficult process, but that is definitely one thing that I learned from Timberleaf that I have been able to apply in my current job. The next, I'm going to talk a little bit about accessibility, and I'm just going to preface this because it's going to go right into a video clip. So.
Okay.
It's okay to laugh. It was really funny. It was really funny.
Finally, a wheelchair ramp for the beach, because this is our first time ever.
We were so excited that there was.
We've got backup. Reinforcements have arrived. Everything's okay.
We were so excited that there was a ramp to the beach. We were so excited because every other beach that we had been to, there had been massive amounts of stairs that everyone else in my group, they would very graciously carry me up and down the stairs, which was really nice. So getting here, I was like, hey, there's a ramp to the beach. I was so excited. And I forgot how wheels are when they hit the sand. That was a mental error on my part. But it has provided laughs for, I'm sure at this point, hundreds of people, because everyone in the group has showed groups of people, so it's been a lot of fun. But the reason I show this is because I had a situation very similar to that just recently. I was taking a donation of books to a library in Wayne County. I don't know if any of you have been to Wayne County, but there's not a lot there. And their basic library system consists of bookmobiles. And so they put all of the books on this big semi-truck, and the truck drives around to all of the rural communities to serve as their library. But they have a repository where they put the books in between, where they're storing some books. So I took the books there, and I go up the ramp of death that was about like this, and then there was another step to get in the building that I had to hop up. And then I'm coming back out of the building, and I hop back down the step, and the woman who had let me into the building had gone back to her office. So nobody was around, and I decide I like to go things really fast. That includes hills. And so I decided, okay, this ramp is no problem. I go down the ramp. I don't notice on my way up that there's a nice lip there, which my front wheels immediately catch. I go flying, land almost on my face, and I have to say that the concrete is a lot less forgiving than sand. So it was a much more painful fall, you could say. That just, bruised my ego. But this, I was just thinking, how is it that this building is not accessible after everything that's been done? I know it's in Little Bicknell, Utah, but still, something needs to happen here. What if somebody comes one day who can't pick themselves back off the ground? Luckily, I have massive upper body strength. I'm just kidding. But, I can get around. I'm very mobile for where I need to go, getting in my car, all of those things that I need to do, I can do. But for people with more limited mobility, maybe somebody with multiple sclerosis or somebody who uses a power wheelchair, as I do accessibility surveys, I always have to keep that in mind, that though I can maybe make this work for me, it's not going to work for everybody else. And I actually did my first full accessibility survey by myself while I was in South Africa. They asked me to go and survey a building that they wanted to have this function in, and they wanted to make sure that people in wheelchairs would be able to get into the building. And so I went there and did a survey and wrote all of the changes that they needed to make because it wasn't a very good building, and sent that to the business owners. And they were really glad to get that feedback. Nobody had ever told them that there was anything wrong with their building. In the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I talked a little bit about earlier. But in South Africa, their one law, which is very vague and nobody is there to monitor it. There's no incentive, there's no punishment if you don't follow this law to make things more accessible. There's nothing there to really push people to want to make things accessible. It's a very vicious cycle because business owners will say, well, I don't have a person with a disability who needs to get into my building. But they don't have anybody because a person with a disability can't get into their building. So that's why the business owner thinks that they don't have any clients or any consumers who would want their services. And so it goes around and around and around until there's one catch that suddenly, maybe they've met somebody, maybe they know somebody who's recently acquired a disability, and it makes them think, oh, well, okay, maybe now I might consider making those changes, at least so my friend can get into my store or my business. So it makes it very interesting to see how those little changes can affect the larger picture. But accessibility is such a huge issue. That's why so many people don't leave their homes. It's really sad to see somebody who has so much potential and they can't leave their house because they can't get anywhere if they do. And that's something, doing that first accessibility survey, it gave me a lot of good experience for what I'm doing now because I do a lot of surveys. and of buildings just to make sure they're up to code. And in the rural towns, really, there is never a building that's fully up to code. But they're trying slowly but slowly. They're trying to make their way. And then the last thing that I want to talk about are school presentations. School presentations are actually something that I've been doing for years and years. Since I started using a wheelchair, the elementary schools in my area would always say, hey, will you come and speak to this group of people? We'd like to hear your perspective on things. But in South Africa, I got to do that a lot more. I had the opportunity of doing several school presentations where I was able to talk about my experiences, and it seemed a lot more impressive to them, the fact that I was coming from the United States. That they kept saying, you came all the way over here just to work with people with disabilities, all the way over here. And that was something that was repeated all the time. And it was really interesting to get to talk with the kids, because I feel like working with kids, they are some of the most accepting people you will ever meet. It doesn't matter what color you are, what you use to get around, any difference that adults would call it, it doesn't matter to kids. They like you for who you are and for, I guess, your entertainment value when you make jokes, and that seemed to be my thing with them. But seeing that gives me such great hope, because if we can teach children now that seeing a person with a disability, they can do just as much as everyone else. It's a great, great concept to teach to kids. And so I started working with that in South Africa, of teaching that message. And then when I started working at the Disability Law Center, they have this great program called Everyone Can. And it really embodied everything that I had ever thought of teaching kids, about showing that it's not about a person's disability. And a disability can be visible, like mine is very visible. You can see that I'm in a wheelchair, obviously. Things are a little different for me. But everyone can have a disability in some way or another. So focusing on kids' abilities, of people in general, focusing on their abilities versus what they can't do as well. We spend so much time as a society focusing on what people can't do and making that the focus of who they are and our perception of them. If we start at a young age of talking about, you did this really well, why don't we work on that? It gives them such a positive spirit that they can, in fact, embrace that and go on and make their mark. So focusing on everyone's abilities versus disabilities. And that is the focus with our school presentations now. And it has grown so much just in the year that I have been working with this program. We're actually working with Southern Utah University to create an actual curriculum program that they can teach at the university in the special education department, where all of their students will go out into the community and teach those programs themselves, so that they get the real experience of going out and working and talking about disabilities, to give them a greater understanding of what it's going to be like when they're actually teaching. So that's a great growth that we have seen. We have had endorsements from Governor Huntsman's wife, and this program is growing more and more because people are really embracing the idea that we do need to focus on that everyone can do something great. And as you can see, this is a message that I feel really, really passionate about, and it's been great being able to teach that. And thinking how it started in South Africa and how I'm able to be part of something so great. So the last thing that I wanted to say is this quote from Nelson Mandela. After climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. And that's from, of course, Nelson Mandela. And this quote has so many meanings to me, but I think the major one for me is within the disability community, because you think, okay, if we can get this legislation passed, we'll be there. But then you get to the top of that, this legislation has been passed, and you think, There is so much more to do. The world will never be perfect, but with all of the work that everyone around is doing, we can really start to see those small hills being overcome. And eventually, hopefully, someday, maybe we will be able to overcome most of the hills that are being faced by millions and millions of people throughout the world. The United States has, they estimate that 1 in 10 people have a disability now, and that percentage will increase in the future as people become elderly. Elderly people face often hearing loss, vision loss. They have mental illnesses come up, dementia, all sorts of different things. And so that percentage will only increase. And so we need to do what we can now to really embrace everyone, regardless of their abilities, and really see what we can do to make our mark on the world. So that is kind of the end of my presentation, and really showing how you can take what you do in a field study and really apply it, even if it's not in an international setting, even if it's not in another country. You can do it locally and make your mark on a small community in a state that you think, okay, things are probably pretty good here. What difference is it going to make? But really, it makes a difference. And even if you never get back out into that international setting like you always wanted to, you can really focus on doing what you can here and making that count. So, and I think we have about 10 minutes left. So any questions that you want to ask, any questions or anything that I didn't cover that you would want to know? I'm open.
Okay, I'm just going to speak really loud, I guess. Yeah. I really enjoyed listening to your very inclusive perspective. I think that made me think about a lot of things, especially about accessibility from your perspective, physical accessibility. And I thought what the implications would be in thinking about also cultural accessibility. I think like you talked about in today's society here in the U.S., that we all have different abilities, and sometimes we focus on what we can't do, and with different populations, the elderly, those with physical disabilities, or immigrants. What are the implications of thinking about how we can make our society more accessible to all these, including cultural accessibility?
Right.
What can we do as a community to make it possible for people to feel included?
I think education is the greatest way to get rid of fears and preconceived notions that people have. And I think that is the problem that a lot of people have with feeling unified as a group. And a lot of time, I use this example a lot with the kids that I teach. I ask them, how many of you were afraid of monsters under your bed and in your closet when you were little? And most of them will raise their hand. And then I usually ask them, why is it that you're not afraid of them now? And most of them will think about it for a minute, and they say, well, it's because I learned that monsters aren't real. And so using that as kind of as a stepping stone into talking about knowledge and how knowing about something and being educated about something takes the fear out. And most people that I have ever talked to that have had anxiety, not necessarily anxiety, but a little hesitation about talking to somebody with a disability and really getting to know them was based on their fear. And in talking to me for a few minutes, and obviously I'm a very different case than other types of disabilities, but it helps alleviate some of that fear because they learned something. And even for me, going into this job, I have never talked to somebody who uses a speech board. There is a person that I know that uses a speech board to communicate. He has cerebral palsy, and he has full faculty of his mind. he is just not able to communicate. And so he is fully paralyzed from the neck down, but he actually uses his head to hit a switch in the back, and it scrolls through words that he wants to use. And I was a little nervous in sitting down and talking with him for the first time, because I thought, is this going to be awkward? What do I need to do? But in learning that it just takes him a little bit longer to respond, and that it's still important to sit down and talk to him and validate him as a person. Validation is so huge, especially for people with disabilities, because they often don't feel validated. And so I think educating will bring about that unity that we really want, both in cultural accessibility as well as all different types of accessibility throughout the board. So, yeah.
You mentioned that part of your purpose in doing your research was to give a voice to people that haven't been heard in the past. Mm-hmm. What other groups are there locally that are still, I guess, powerless to express themselves and what they need?
I would say one of the greatest groups that you will find that cannot express themselves are people with developmental disabilities. And that includes anything from Down syndrome to, and that's not true. There's such a broad range of Down syndrome. Many are very eloquent and they can express their needs very well. But depending on the spectrum of intellectual disabilities, they are often put in institutions, and anybody in an institutionalized setting, they have lost their voice. And it's really difficult because a lot of them have really great needs that aren't coming across because they may not be able to communicate like everyone else. They don't have somebody who's taking the time to listen to them and to find out what they need with what they're doing. And so that's been my experience with all of the populations of people with disabilities. They seem to be the ones who have the least amount of voice. So.
I was just wondering, kind of, with we talked a lot about the accessibility. Mm-hmm. What about the social perceptions here versus in East London and South Africa, and kind of that, like you said, that uneducation and that perception of people, and how did you feel that people generally viewed them in South Africa and then also here?
That's a great question. The social awareness and social acceptance of people with disabilities is slowly starting to rise. It's slowly starting to rise because there are more people out there, and it goes back to the education. I think that acceptance wasn't there before because people thought, I don't ever see people in wheelchairs around. I don't see people with disabilities, so I don't really need to focus on that acceptance. And then when they did see them, it was almost like, maybe you should go back to where you belong, back in your house, back in your institution, back in your special school, wherever it is that they came from. That's where they needed to go back. But because there are people breaking down those barriers, it's starting to help more and more. The director of the organization that I worked for, it's called Rehab. Her name was Zininzi, and she was pretty much the queen of Sheba. She would order people around. All of the Kombi drivers, the big taxis in South Africa, they knew her well because whenever she came, she would order them to pick her up and put her in the taxi. And she had no qualms about asking people for anything. And so it started to help that progression because people saw her. And they saw that she was out doing things, that she had gained an education, and all things that people never thought that she would be able to do. And so it's very interesting to see those progressions and see that rise. Here in the United States, it's still, people will never be blatantly rude, but they're curious because I think that education still isn't always there. I have had more people stare at me since I moved down to Cedar City than I have in my entire life, and that's saying a lot because people are generally pretty curious, which is fine with me. I did have one little boy who asked me after presentation. Hunting is really big in southern Utah. He asked me if he shot me in the leg with a gun, if I would be able to feel it. I hoped that we would avoid that. So, but there's definitely some different perceptions that people may not be able to do things as well just because they have a disability. And so it's forums like this that we can start breaking down those attitudes, those barriers, and hopefully strive to just keep going forward. Because basically, I get around differently than most people, but I was a student here. I understand college life. I'm essentially the same in every other way. Not that we all want to be the same, but you know what I mean. And so it's trying to get those messages out that people are people, regardless of how they communicate, how they get around, what in their mind makes them different, what in society's mind makes them different. People are people. So, did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank
Okay.
You talked about how people with mental disabilities, when they're institutionalized, they lose their voice, and I think that's a really good point. What do you think would be an ideal situation for people with mental disabilities so they can have a voice heard and they can lead a life where they will fulfill the potential they have?
Right. That's a really good point. And I think one way to really break down that is that in large institutional settings, one of the major problems is that they're often understaffed. There's not enough people to really focus on one person. But when you get into a smaller group home facility, and that's kind of a generalization, but getting that long-term care that they need, because there are some people who are very medically needy and their families really cannot take care of them. I'm not saying that's the case for all people who are institutionalized by any means, because there are many, many people who are institutionalized who should never have been put there in the first place. But disbanding things, I hate to bring politics into this, but the State Developmental Center, that is a huge campus. They have close to 200 people there, and there's not always a lot. They get the care they need, but there's not that one-on-one time to really build the relationships that these people need. And so it's in situations like that, they really need to go to a more localized group setting within their own communities. Because in southern Utah, people still have to go up here for long-term care facilities. And I had one man who was telling me one day, he said, I haven't been able to see my daughter in a couple of months because she's all the way up in American Fork, and I can't get up there to see her. There's nothing in southern Utah for families to be able to stay connected and really have them be involved. And that's, I think, another component of the problem is in situations like that, a lot of times families can't be involved in the family member's care and really being able to interact with them and talk with them and find out their needs. Because family members are often the ones who will be able to get that type of information out of the consumer anyways. So it's important that those bridges be built. So did that answer your question? Okay. Are there any other? I think we are. Do we have time for one more? Okay.
I was just wondering, in terms of making local solutions and the percentage of people like with different needs and blending them into a situation, what are some of the resources you use? I remember a friend of mine was teaching third grade or something. She had one blind child in her classroom, and not sufficient help ongoing for that child, so it made it very difficult to manage the needs of all of the other children in the classroom. And so in communities like in rural Utah, what percentage of people in a given community are needing help, and how do you organize the resources so that people don't feel like, well, my kid's not getting an education because the teacher's spending all the time with the special needs kinds of things that build up all the time.
Right. That's a great question. One thing that is becoming more and more used are something called paraprofessionals, formerly called aides. So really getting them in to help the kids with the more individualized tasks while the teacher helps some of the other students, and then that teacher can also go in and work with that aide and the child and really getting them the educational services that they need. So that's one change that we're starting to see. There was actually a great meeting that I attended just about a month ago where the superintendent of the Washington County School District, which is St. George, he sat down and said, we understand that there are a lot of needs that aren't being met, and we really want to do something about it. And so having those one-on-one dialogues of people who are really wanting to make that change happen is so important. Other organizations that I see making a huge difference are the independent living centers, and they're located all across the state. But they do a lot of training and one-on-one attention with people with disabilities that a lot of other organizations can't always take that time to do. They're really focused on the consumer themselves. Other services that seem to be doing a lot of good, the Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, the Division of Services for the Blind and Visually Impaired, they really try and do a lot of outreach because the percentage in southern Utah of people with disabilities is about 4% higher than the national average. So in Washington County, so St. George, 20% of the population has a disability. And that is in part because of the aging community that is there. But that's quite common throughout the entire state of that much more than the national average. And so we have quite a large percentage of Utah who has a disability. And it's really important to see those services being given, that the needs are being met, and those are some of the organizations that are really stepping up to try and help their clients. So, yes, great.